The morning of January 15th, 1947. A woman named Betty Basinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter down Norton Avenue in the Lamette Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. It was a Tuesday morning. The street was quiet. At the edge of a vacant lot, something caught her eye. She thought at first it was a department store mannequin. White posed, lying in the grass near the sidewalk. She looked closer. It was not a mannequin. It was a woman. A young woman. Nude. Cut completely in half at the waist. Drained of every drop of blood. Washed clean. Arranged with deliberate precision just feet from the sidewalk, as if placed there for someone to find. The killer had carved 3-inch gashes into the corners of her mouth. A Glasgow smile cut into her face. After she was already dead, Betty Basinger grabbed her daughter and ran to the nearest house to call the police. Within hours, Los Angeles knew. Within days, America knew. The young woman was identified as Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, from Medford, Massachusetts. She had come to Los Angeles hopping to become an actress. She was found in a vacant lot with no blood left in her body. Over 750 investigators worked her case. Over 150 suspects were identified. Over 500 people confessed to her murder over the following decades. Not one of them was ever charged. Not one. 78 years later, the Black Dahlia murder is still unsolved. And it is still, by most accounts, the most famous unsolved murder in American history. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. When Elizabeth was 6 years old, her father abandoned the family. He left his car on a bridge and disappeared, allowing the family to believe he had committed suicide. He had not. He was living in California. Elizabeth grew up in difficult circumstances. She suffered from severe asthma as a child and spent winters in warmer climates, staying with family friends in Florida. She was pretty and social, known for her black hair and dark clothing. At some point, she began dyeing her hair jet black, a striking look that would later give her the name the press assigned to her in death. In her late teens, she moved to California to find her father. They reconciled briefly, but it did not last. She stayed in California. She worked as a waitress and tried to break into acting. She had no known screen credits. She moved frequently, staying with various acquaintances, struggling to find stable work and housing in post-war Los Angeles. She was described by people who knew her as kind and cheerful and somewhat naive. She frequented jazz clubs and nightclubs. She dated men, but according to multiple accounts, she was not sexually active. Witnesses consistently described her as someone who enjoyed male attention, but kept relationships at a distance. She was 22 years old. She had not yet figured out what her life was going to be. She never got the chance. The last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive was January 9, 1947. A man named Robert Manley, a 25-year-old salesman she had been seeing, drove her to the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. She was supposed to meet her sister there. Manley dropped her off and drove home to his wife. Witnesses saw Elizabeth Short in the Biltmore lobby. She made a phone call from a payphone inside the hotel. Then she walked out the front door. She was seen walking toward a bus stop. After that, nothing. For 6 days, Elizabeth Short was unaccounted for. Nobody who came forward in the subsequent investigation could say with certainty where she was between January 9th and January 15th. The medical examiner estimated she had been held for those 6 days. Held somewhere private. A house or a room or a building where someone kept her for nearly a week. Where she was tortured. The autopsy found evidence of blunt force trauma to her head and face. Evidence that she had been restrained. Evidence that she had been tortured over a period of hours or days before her death. The official cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage and shock. She died from blows to the head. After she died, her killer performed a surgical bisection. The body was cut in half at the waist, with a precision that investigators immediately identified as the work of someone with anatomical knowledge. The cuts were clean, the technique was practiced. This was not a frenzied act. This was deliberate. Medical and anatomy knowledge or training. That detail would define the investigation for decades. The Lamett Park vacant lot where Elizabeth Short's body was placed was not where she was killed. Her body had been completely drained of blood. Washed clean with precision. There was no blood in the lot, not a single drop. She was transporting there after death, arranged, displayed. Placed near the sidewalk in full view. The killer wanted her to be found. The positioning of her body was not random. Her arms were raised above her head. Her legs were spread apart. The pose was deliberate. Investigators noted immediately that the disposal site had been selected carefully. Accessible by car, visible from the street, in a residential neighborhood where discovery was guaranteed. 8 days after the murder, the Los Angeles Examiner received a package. Inside was Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her social security card, her address book with the name Mark Hansen embossed on the cover, photographs, names written on pieces of paper, and a note cut from newspaper clippings. It read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." Everything in the package had been wiped with gasoline. No fingerprints. The letter that was promised never came. The killer had her belongings. The killer had mailed them to a newspaper. And the killer had left no trace of themselves on any of it. The LAPD put 750 investigators on the Black Dahlia case. 750. That number is almost incomprehensible. They interviewed over 1,000 people. They identified 150 suspects. They received over 60 confessions during the initial investigation alone. Not one of those confessions held up. The man who drove Elizabeth Short to the Biltmore, Robert Manley, was the initial prime suspect. He was arrested and questioned intensively. He passed multiple polygraph tests. He was released. He was eventually committed to a mental hospital by his wife, not for the murder, but for an unrelated breakdown. The address book found in the killer's package led investigators to a nightclub owner named Mark Hansen. His name was on the cover. Hansen had 75 names in his book. Investigators tracked down every one of them. Every man told the same story. They had met Elizabeth Short at a club or bar. They had bought her drinks or dinner. She had made clear she was not interested in a physical relationship. They never saw her again. By mid-February 1947, just 1 month after the discovery of the body, the Los Angeles Daily News reported that the investigation had run into a stone wall. No new leads. No new suspects. No answers. The case stayed in the headlines for 35 consecutive days. Then it faded, and it never fully closed. For decades, theories about the Black Dahlia murder circulated without any single suspect emerging as definitively more credible than the others. Then in 2003, a retired LAPD detective named Steve Hodel published a book. It was called Black Dahlia Avenger. Steve Hodel's suspect was his own father, Dr. George Hodel, a prominent Los Angeles physician, brilliant, connected, known to Los Angeles society and the entertainment world. George Hodel had a background in medicine that would explain the precision of the bisection. He had a history of violence toward women. He was accused of raping his own daughter, though he was acquitted. A secretary of his died under suspicious circumstances. Steve Hodel found a photograph among his father's possessions that he believed showed Elizabeth Short. He found receipts for concrete bags the same size and brand as bags found near her body. And then he found the police files. In 2004, unreleased Los Angeles District Attorney files were discovered in a vault. A George Hodel/Black Dahlia file. The files confirmed that George Hodel had been one of the original 6 prime suspects. The LAPD had taken him seriously enough to bug his home in 1950. On one of those recordings, George Hodel was captured saying, "Supposin' I did kill the Black Dahlia." He was never charged. A deputy district attorney who reviewed the file later gave his legal opinion that the case was solved. But that opinion was never formalized, never taken to trial. George Hodel fled the United States in 1950 and lived overseas for 40 years. He returned to America in 1990. He died in 2009, at 91 years old, without ever being charged. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She had asthma as a child and spent winters in warmer places so she could breathe. She loved jazz clubs and dark clothing, and she came to California because that is where her father was. She wanted to be an actress. She was working as a waitress. She was 22 years old, and she had not yet built the life she was trying to build. What happened to her in those 6 days between January 9th and January 15th of 1947 is something the investigation never fully reconstructed. Someone held her for 6 days. Someone tortured her. Someone killed her with blows to the head and then performed a surgical dissection on her body. Someone washed her and arranged her in a vacant lot in broad daylight. Someone mailed her belongings to a newspaper and wiped every fingerprint from every surface with gasoline. That person moved through post-war Los Angeles. They had anatomical knowledge or training. They were organized enough to hold someone for nearly a week without being discovered. They were careful enough to leave no fingerprints. Careful enough to disappear completely. And whatever the LAPD knew or suspected about George Hodel was never enough. Or never pursued enough. Or suppressed enough. 78 years later, the case is still technically open. The LAPD Cold Case Unit still lists it as unsolved. The file is still there. And Elizabeth Short is still buried at Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. No one has ever answered for what was done to her. January 15th, 1947. A woman on a morning walk with her daughter sees something at the edge of a vacant lot on Norton Avenue. She thinks it is a mannequin. She looks closer. It is not a mannequin. It is a young woman, 22 years old, from Massachusetts. She came to California because that is where her father was. She stayed because she wanted to be an actress. She was working as a waitress. She was cut in half and arranged in a field, and the person who did it mailed her identification to a newspaper and was never caught. 750 investigators. 150 suspects. 500 confessions. No charges. 78 years. The Black Dahlia murder is the oldest open homicide investigation in Los Angeles. It is the case that invented the modern true crime genre. Every newspaper, every documentary, every investigation that obsessed over a crime and made a victim famous instead of mourned. It started on Norton Avenue, in a vacant lot, on a Tuesday morning in January 1947, with a woman who thought she saw a mannequin. Do you believe George Hodel killed Elizabeth Short, or do you think the real answer is buried somewhere else entirely? Tell me below.